Good morning, everyone. It's great to be in Townsville, and I live in Armidale these days. It got up to 7 yesterday and was sleeting, so it's very similar climate. I was telling my wife, but I understand you've had a few cold snaps up here as well, but goes with the territory down my way. Look, I thought today it would be worth just going through what's happening, just having a bit of a global outlook of demand for our red meat product. There's some really big opportunities for our industry. There's a few challenges as well, that we always tend to face various challenges, but there's some interesting ones at the moment. I guess that environment within which we operate affects all of us. And so the way we've structured ourselves now within the R&D team in MLA, we're taking a whole farm system and supply chain approach. So it's really important for us to understand how we then need to operate as a supply chain within that environment. And then I really want to spend a bit of time on some of the complex challenges that we all need to solve together, because I don't think any individual or individual organisation is going to solve some of these challenges on their own. So let's just jump into what the market outlook looks like. And we export heavy. We export about 70% of our beef production. Our domestic market is still our largest and most valuable market. So it's really important servicing our domestic market. But when we start looking at what are our big export markets, Japan, the US, Korea and China make up the big four. And you'll see on there that the Middle East and North Africa, that's a real growth area for us. And we've got some emerging, bigger markets closer to our doorstep throughout Southeast Asia. But you'll see that Europe is quite small in terms of volume, but it's a high value per kilo market. And it's really important to think about that when we look ahead at what are the big opportunities for us. What drives a lot of that demand is, we differentiate ourselves in the global market on quality, on consistency, on shelf life of our product. And what we say we're going to deliver, we deliver. It's amazing that you wouldn't think that that would happen, but when I was based overseas, the importers buying product from Brazil, for example, might order 1 container of strip loins and 3 might turn up. Or they might order 4 containers and only 1 turns up. And the product out of Uruguay, they would have 90 days shelf life on it. And they said, well, the very best piece of meat in that container might make 90 days. But Australian shelf life was 120 to 140 days, and the worst bit of meat would exceed that. So we do differentiate ourselves very well in the market. But what also keeps us in the game is reducing economic barriers to trade. So you can see back in 2004, we didn't have any major free trade agreements. And then since that time, we've had the deal with New Zealand, with the US, that was a big one. And then when the free trade agreements came into force with Japan, then Korea, and then China, they were game changers. Because prior to those free trade agreements, product going into Korea attracts a 40% duty. 40% of the import value gets added on top. That goes down to 0 over the life of that free trade agreement. It's about 20% today. So those reducing barriers to trade, economic barriers, in Japan it was 38.5%, goes down to 9% under the Trans-Pacific Partnership deal. So those barriers keep us in the game. And what's really important is that now those major markets with all those free trade agreements in place are covering about 90% of our exports are now covered by free trade agreement. But the big ones are still to come. So it's amazing that these two guys, both of them are doing really well, aren't they? But they did one of the best deals that we've seen for ages. Like the beef deal into the UK, and this is a bit close to my heart because when I was over there, it was so frustrating when we only had 7,200 tonnes of beef access into Europe. And that happened, those quotas were set when the UK entered the EU. So it's totally disproportionate. Our sheep quota is 19,200 tonnes into the whole of the EU. The Kiwis have 280,000 tonnes of sheep meat access. So it's very disproportionate. So doing a deal with the UK, so it was much easier after Brexit because you're dealing with one country, pro-trade, long-term trading partner with Australia. The day that this agreement comes into force, we have 35,000 tonnes of beef access just into the UK. So it's a game changer. We export about 3,000 tonnes at the moment. And it's going to be no duties in quota. After 10 years, it goes up to 110,000 tonnes of beef access just into the UK, 60 million people. and then it's no quota, no duty after 10 years. It's one of the best deals that we've seen. So the big focus areas now is getting a deal done with the rest of the EU, 27 member states that don't trust each other, let alone how well we endear ourselves to some of the major trading partners like France in submarine deals. That doesn't sort of help us that much. But one of the positives in the change in government, it has improved some of those relationships, and we're confident that we will be able to get a deal done with the EU. And 300 million people who love our product, they eat a lot of meat, and they're prepared to pay for it, and they value quality. So that's very exciting from my perspective. But our ability to supply is certainly constrained. It's no surprise to anyone. We've been through numerous herd fluctuations, and we really came off a run of really bad years through the 2018 and 19 in particular. It's been a slow recovery because not everywhere got a break in 2020, but we've strung a couple of good years together in most places now. So the herd is certainly growing. But interestingly, the slaughter numbers aren't picking up as fast as the herd recovery. So our forecast for this year is only 6.2 million. Our 5-year average is about 8 million national adult cattle slaughter. When you consider those big years in 14-15 where we slaughtered 9.2 million cattle and exported 1.2 million, so over 10 million cattle leaving the system, and we've got 6 million, bit over 6 million national adult cattle slaughter, and live export forecasts only around 500,000 head. The herd is rebuilding, but we're clearly retaining more females. So when the female cattle slaughter goes over about 47%, we're in decline, and it's well below that at the moment. But we hit nearly 60% of our cattle slaughter in 2019 was females. So we're in liquidation when it gets to those levels. We're also seeing a much larger proportion of our production now coming out of the feedlot sector. So you'll see that our export volumes won't be back as much as the decline in adult cattle slaughter because carcass weights are going up. About 50% of our production is coming out of feedlots. If you ever read Beef Central's trading numbers on the feedlots, no one would own one, but they've all expanded over the last few years. They're paying more than they ever have for cattle, more than they ever have for grain, and they're still making money. So that's very positive signs. And so what does that mean for price? Well, the outlook is still quite positive. Everyone's forecasting prices to come off record highs. I mean, the ECI yesterday was 990 cents. Off highs of over 1,100, getting close to 1,200 cents. But no one's predicting anything to crash. That's the beauty of the environment we're in. So it comes off a bit and it works for everyone. We're at a much higher base than we've ever seen before. So that's the real positive. I'll get into some of the headwinds a bit later on because trade disruption is probably the major risk, and there's a lot of tension around China. In live export, there's growing competition from Indian buffalo. It's just very cheap. They sell tenderloins for $4 a kilo. So, I mean, but it's a terrible product. But they're targeting the traditional wet market. Now, we'll talk a bit about foot and mouth disease a bit later and lumpy skin disease because I don't want to get distracted by that at the moment, but it's very important that we table those risks, and I will talk about that right at the end. So let's jump into what does that mean? So from a production sector point of view, all of those trends, so what drives a consumer? What do our customers want? That's being translated into brands. We've seen a proliferation of beef brands. Every processor now has brands that segregate product based on different categories of quality, and we're quality driven. It's a very positive thing. And we have a home for the whole range of quality, which is very, very good. So, but those brand specifications are changing the way that producers are getting paid. So specs are changing, and those company specs tend to relate to what they're offering a customer in a brand, and we need that feedback to flow seamlessly back through the supply chain so the production sector can respond. So it's really important we get that information because we can get much more information now on our livestock. We can make better decisions on breeding, feeding, finishing, and producing animals with a market destination in mind. And I think that's really important for how we really create and capture more value. We're going to get more accurate information as well. We've got 4 objective measurement devices accredited now in the AusMeat language to collect eating quality traits, and we'll see those technologies being adopted. We're really driving hard on that, particularly in the beef side. We've also seen some pretty big advances in the sheep industry on automation, and we're on that journey in beef, but we've got it's going to be more complicated. Lamb is much more consistent in terms of size. There's not as much variability, but we are working on that. We've got Tees Australia at Rockhampton that are hosting an R&D room. They built a room. We've got prototype equipment in there looking to automate beef boning. But the objective measurement technologies on quality are really helping us with precision, repeatability and consistency across plants. And I think as I was talking about those markets evolving, and I think Indonesia is a really interesting case because we've been traditionally relying on wet markets as the main outlet for our Australian cattle that are processed in Indonesia, sold through the wet markets. But when you have those competitors coming in and cheaper alternatives, and this goes with most markets, we need to find higher value outlets. And we're seeing that there's an emerging middle class as wages increase, people are seeking out better quality, and we can target, even with cattle that we've exported into more sophisticated supply chains in Indonesia. We're working with importers and exporters who are wanting to explore those channels, and we're doing that in market. So that's really important. I think the other piece, which is probably a theme for today, is then how do we actually translate the work we're doing in R&D across the whole supply chain? How do we get that into producers' hands? How do we drive that productivity? How do we get more precision in our production system? And so days like this, where we talk about awareness activities, this is basically our extension programs where we're doing beef up forums. The network with livestock advisors is untapped, and I'd love to build on what you're doing here today. But then we can take producers on a journey. We've got short courses that build capability. The Edge network is really important. Nutrition Edge, grazing land management, breeding edge, business edge, all of those packages. We're going to have a carbon edge package coming out shortly as well. Bred well, fed well. All of those things are really important to build skills. And really where we drive change is through engaging on long-term investments through demonstration sites, profitable grazing systems, where we can work over a number of seasons, provide the support to producers to make that change in their businesses. But it's not easy. Working with Navrak over the last, since 2015, we've had the regional consultation giving us the priorities for R&D investment. One of the top priorities for Northern Australia was improving calf survival, reducing breeder mortality. And we just weren't getting projects that on their own were going to shift the dial on those big complex issues. So we formed a strategic partnership where we had researchers, producers and service providers designing programs of work that we can then invest in. And we've now got producer groups being set up that are driving the agenda for what they implement within their businesses through a more collaborative approach than we've seen before. And it's getting a better balance between new R&D and adoption within the one program. We're also getting better information to be able to make better genetic selection decisions and put more selection pressure on reproduction. So we've run a repronomics program that we're now co-funding with the Department of Ag in Queensland and with UNE. We've got Brahman Drought Master Santa. I think there's Belmont Reds now in the southern group, and other breeds are interested in getting involved. But it's allowed those northern breeds to implement single-step genetics, which is you can take a genotype and get a full set of breeding values without any other performance measures. And that only works when you've got a well-measured reference population. The other challenge we've got is that I haven't been anywhere where sustainability of our industry doesn't come up. And one of the key investments that we're making is to be carbon neutral by 2030. And we're looking at emissions avoidance and carbon storage as the real key areas, and we're looking at a net zero position. Now, when you listen to the targets that the federal government are setting, and they're wanting to reduce emissions by, was it 43% by 2030? This is where we are today, and I think this has been updated more recently, where it's about 57 or 8% now that we've reduced emissions from the 2005 baseline. So we're well ahead of the game. This is one of the few times where we're ahead of the emerging issues. We've got about $100 million worth of investment looking at feed additive technologies, feed-based investments and genetics that are going to improve our net position. And there's going to be a whole range of tools and technologies available in order for our industry to achieve carbon neutrality by 2030. So we're ahead of the game, but you'll hear a bit more about that later. Julia, you're on a panel a bit later, aren't you? So Julia's our expert, not me. But no, happy to get any questions on that as well. So just lastly, I just wanted to touch on foot and mouth disease and lumpy skin disease. So, given that these diseases are on our doorstep, it's really important that the main game is keeping them out. So we're working very closely with the federal government. They control the borders, but they're also providing support in Indonesia. Our government's purchased quite a lot of vaccine that's available for use in Indonesia. We've got staff in Indo that are working with the feedlots and with importers on ramping up their biosecurity plans. And we also have provided some infrastructure to help get vaccines in cattle. The other important piece, which I think every producer needs to understand, is what their obligations are. So we've seen a lot of social media around what everyone's expecting the federal government to do. The Ag Minister's in Indonesia this week, working on how to support Indonesia appropriately. And then I guess we need to make sure that every producer's biosecurity plans are in place, that we understand what the signs are of foot and mouth disease and lumpy skin disease, that we make sure that producers know who to call, the emergency animal disease hotline. We have the AusVet plan, and industry's more organised than I've seen on these issues. And when I talk about industry, this is what I mean. So I think everyone comes to MLA because we're visible, we are well resourced, but it's very clear in our funding agreement that we can't do policy work. So the peak industry councils are responsible for doing the policy work, and the production councils are the feedlot industry, Cattle Council of Australia, goat industry and sheep producers. And then for live export, it's ALEC and the Australian Meat Industry Council for processors. MLA are the service provider, Live Corp for live export, and the Australian Meat Processor Corporation is the service company for the processing sector. But they're all members of RMAC, the Red Meat Advisory Council. RMAC are running a task force. They're running the ruler over the AusVet plan. They have task forces that are working across each part of the supply chain to understand how we would implement a crisis response should these diseases enter. I've personally been involved in the live export crisis simulations for lumpy skin disease and foot and mouth disease. And so we're as prepared as we can be. But as I said, the main game is keeping it out. We've got Beth Cookson on the agenda today. She reports into the chief vet and is an absolute expert on the risks and how we need to keep foot and mouth disease out. So I'm sure it's very topical, but Beth's the expert. But anyway, happy to take any questions if we've got time on anything I've presented or anything that's on your mind. Thank you.